I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Cloudbusting, When Not to Strive for a Cloud-Based Solution. My name is Arlene Itori, and I'm a webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute, and it is our pleasure to be the co-host of today's event with Blue Hill Data Services. I'll be working in the background to help answer any technical or general questions that you may have. We encourage you at any time during the presentation to submit your questions to today's speakers. To do this, click on the questions box, type your question in the space provided, and click on the submit button. Today's webinar is being recorded. You will be receiving a follow-up email in approximately 2 days, which will include a link with today's recorded webinar and presentation slides. The webinar recording and the presentation slides will also be available at outsourcing.com. Now I'd like to say a few words about the Outsourcing Institute. The Outsourcing Institute is a professional association dedicated to providing independent best practices, tools, roadshow events, and networking opportunities for all types of outsourcing. Located at outsourcing.com, we have 70,000 members globally. OI specializes in providing low-cost and no-cost alternatives for outsourcing buyers in need of RFP tools, vendor selection assistance, training, as well as general support and coaching. For those of you who market into this space, we offer an array of very targeted sponsorship and promotional opportunities. Our sister company, CMS, provides recruiting services for those seeking to hire outsourced professionals experienced at buying, selling, managing, or consulting in this arena. Our contact information is on the bottom of the screen. Now I'd like to share with you an event we have in March. It's called the Wall Street Tech Conference. It's being held on March 13th. And this show will be covering topics on what's known as T5, and those topics include sourcing, cloud computing, big data, mobility, security, and compliance. If you're planning to be in New York City on March 13th, we hope you can join us. To find out more details, please visit outsourcing.com/events. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to our moderator, Michael Engel, Managing Partner at Sylvan Advisory, for the formal introduction of today's speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene, and good afternoon. To begin, I'd like to thank our host, the Outsourcing Institute, and our sponsor, Blue Hill Data Services, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Our topic this afternoon is aptly entitled Cloud Busting, and it's a discussion regarding the applicability of cloud solutions. And from my perspective, it promises to be both provoking and informative. My name is Michael Engel, and I am the Managing Partner with Sylvan Advisory, and I'll be your moderator throughout the call. Our distinguished speakers this afternoon are Mark Reich from Sylvan Advisory and Rosary DeFillippis from Blue Hill Data Services. In way of background, Mark is a Senior Manager with Sylvan Advisory. He's located in the Netherlands. Mark's background includes a number of years as both a provider of outsourcing services and an advisor with such esteemed firms as Accenture, Deloitte, and now with Sylvan Advisory. He is our resident cloud expert globally for Sylvan Advisory. From Blue Hill Data Services, we have, as I said, Rosary DeFillippis. She's the Executive Director of Business Development, and she's the Chief Marketing Officer. And she's responsible for developing and managing the company's growth strategy. Throughout the discussion this morning, I'd like to encourage you to submit questions to me through your control panel, as Arlen mentioned. And I'll either interject those during the discussion or submit your questions at the end, time permitting. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mark Reich. Mark?
Thank you, Michael. So let me start off by explaining why we're going to talk about when not to use a cloud-based solution instead of why to use a cloud-based solution. Over the last year, or 18 months rather, we've seen a very big difference in the way most organizations approach the cloud. Where before we were trying to get companies to understand why the cloud was going to be beneficial to them, we feel like we've hit a tipping point where right now most companies are very aware of all the benefits that the cloud brings, and they are trying to get there as soon as possible. And because of that, the new differentiation between a good company and a great company is not so much the speed with which they're going to embrace a cloud solution, but the intelligence that they have in deciding which parts of their current compute environment aren't actually suitable to go to a cloud environment. And so we named this presentation Cloudbusting, and we're talking about when not to use a cloud-based solution. And so in the next slides, we'll go through 9 reasons why not to use a cloud-based solution. But before we can do that, we should talk about how we approach cloud analyses and what the definition of a cloud is. Next slide, please. So at Sylvan, we use something that we call the Cloud Prism, and it's basically 5 different angles that we try to cover when we're analyzing a company. And so these different angles are migrating the apps, managing risks, meeting the SLAs, managing the cloud, and what we call total cost of ownership. The difficulty when we're looking at the migration of apps are all around the fact that they might not be able to be conveniently migrated, that the platform needs to be updated, software needs to be updated, that there's a whole problem around the discovery of the information within the organization. We really often find that when a company starts out with their journey towards a cloud-based solution, the first step in diligence is figuring out what it is that they have running right now, and oftentimes that's a very difficult process to go through. And so that costs money, and we need to take that into account when assessing whether going to a cloud is a viable option. The second angle, like I said, is managing risks. This deals with legal and regulatory risks, compliance issues, and all kinds of stuff that that goes different. When you're dealing with a cloud-based solution, the rules and regulations that you follow, and we'll go into depth into these later on in the deck, pretty important. We'll talk about ITAR, FSMA, and IPA. The fourth point, managing the cloud, is really about the difficulty that you have in managing cloud applications, where the control is, who's managing the vendors, where your data is, who owns the data, and stuff like that. And so the last angle in the Cloud Prism is the total cost of ownership. Are really all costs that are going to be applicable, accounted for in your model? Are all the savings that you envision going to be realistic? And so we use these 5 angles to analyze a project. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about a slide, I think what we need to do first is define what is a cloud. And so the most broadly accepted definition of a cloud says that there's 5 characteristics. And the first one is on-demand self-service. The second one is broad network access. There's resource pooling. There is rapid elasticity and measured service. On-demand self-service means that you're going to be able to either add virtual machines or increase the RAM for a virtual machine, add new users if it's a SaaS solutions, without the intervention of the vendor. The second point, broad network access, really pertains to the fact that a cloud is not a cloud if you really can't easily and ubiquitously connect to it. So that means that in general, being able to connect to a cloud solution either through the internet or different means for everyone in the organization is a requirement for it to be called a cloud. The third point is resource pooling. And resource pooling really is about the fact that you can't assume that the hardware is going to be dedicated to you. So sometimes in a private cloud solution, that's going to be the case. But in general, in a cloud, resources are pooled between virtual machines and different users of the environment. The fourth attribute, rapid elasticity, really deals with the fact that you're going to be able to increase or decrease your consumption of compute in the cloud over time. And again, that doesn't require the intervention of a vendor. So you're able to do that yourself. You're able to scale up, scale down. You're able to increase the size of an environment or add environments as you need. And the fifth point is measured service. If you're looking at a cloud solution as a utility, what you need is a way to measure what is actually being consumed. And so the fifth attribute of a cloud is the ability to actually measure what is being used in terms of CPU or I/O or RAM. And so the associated deployment models that we have is, like I already talked about, the private cloud or a public cloud or a hybrid cloud, which is a combination of the two. And so what we're finding is that more and more that multi-tenant public clouds are running mission-critical ERP these days. And that's something that we actually didn't see a few years ago. And the other thing is that there's very significant differences between cloud solutions from various vendors. I think the last remark on this slide is that cloud is not a suite of technology, even though technology is an enabler. What really makes a cloud is a change of mindset that's required, because it's all about the agility and the time to market. It's about being able to pay by the drink for your compute needs. And this is really an operating model question and not so much a technology question. Next slide, please. So these are the 9 points that we'll talk about. I don't want to spend too much time on that now. Let's just continue to the first point. Next slide. Yeah, so the first point is that the internet is not a utility yet. Sometimes this is very difficult to comprehend from the perspective of a North American or European or a developed Asian nation. But the reality is that oftentimes when corporations they move to a cloud for part of their compute environment or part of their portfolio of applications, the problem becomes that not every location in the world has access to reliable high-speed access. And so if you need to change the way you connect or network globally, the issue is basically that some of the remote locations might not be able to benefit from the cloud as you originally calculate. And so even though cloud solutions are often explored as a means of reducing costs, the cost of the changes that you need to do to your MPLS or your other connectivity, buying extra lines, oftentimes is not in the original estimate, and it really needs to be in your total cost of ownership model. Another point that pertains to the internet as a utility or not is the fact that those connections, all these new connections to a SaaS provider or to your infrastructure as a service cloud somewhere, these connections, they need to be secure. And so this really expands the scope of data and connection security within your organization. And again, if you have more work to do there, that's not going to be free. Next slide, please.
Mark, before you go on, there's a question or maybe a challenge regarding the internet as a utility.
Sure.
So the question is really around, is it really an issue considering the internet being so pervasive in the U.S. and Europe?
Well, like I said before, it's not an issue if you're looking at locations within the U.S. or in Europe. I think about the only thing more reliable connection-wise than an internet connection in those countries is plain old telephone service. So from that perspective, absolutely, you're right. It's basically a non-issue. It becomes very interesting when we're dealing, let's say, an ERP environment for a large company that's active globally, and they have remote manufacturing capabilities in countries like Vietnam or remote locations in Brazil, you name it. And so if the company in the US or in Europe decides to change the way the entire globe needs to connect to their applications, oftentimes they spend too little time on the feasibility of actually being able to connect to that system from these remote locations. So sometimes it's just expensive to do so, and sometimes it's absolutely impossible to do so. Does that answer the question, Mike?
I would think so, if there's no follow-up.
Good. So actually, we are already on the next slide, which is called Clouds Are Robust, but are the companies that own them. So there's something really interesting going on. When you're buying a service, instead of being really focused on the robustness of all of the components in your IT environment, what you're focused on is the uptime that's promised, the robustness of the service that you're getting. And since that's getting better and better, what we're seeing is that actually the onus of the risk of the entire deal is moving towards not so much the service that they're providing or the promised uptime. It's really about whether or not the company is stable and robust. And so this concept is being compounded by the fact that some of the most advanced cloud technology that's around, and this goes for both software as a service, as infrastructure as a service, or platform as a service. Some of this technology is found in very small, very young, agile companies, and those companies have only been around for a couple of years. These are small companies, and they have very different risk patterns from established players, which basically means that they're smaller. It's more difficult to get insight into their financials. They're sometimes very expensively funded. They need to grow really quickly. And so that leads to the next point. Because of that requirement for growth, what they do is they try to buy the business. And so they go out, they offer you very competitive rates, and so you move your cloud environment to them. You start working with them, and then the question becomes if they're actually able to sustain their business model over time, given the fact that they've got relatively low margins because they want to grow the business. So it's a very different risk from, let's say, working with a blue chip company. I think the last point I need to make here is that this is really still a nascent market. Even though everyone's talking about the cloud and every company is trying to offer a cloud in some shape or form, I feel like we're still in, and I'm going to make a comparison to the automobile, where right now everybody just assumes that having a steering wheel is the best way to drive a car, but cars started out having a tail, and so at some point in time that changed and it just became the dominant way of doing things. And the cloud market, in my mind, is still very much at the beginning. And so that means that most of the disruptive change and change in this market is still to come, and that means that most of the consolidation that we think we're going to see in the market is still to come. And so these smaller players are either going to be bought or going to try grow quickly in IPO, or they're actually going to change altogether, and instead of trying to be a cloud provider, what they'll do is they'll take their very nifty software and they'll spin and pivot into being a software company, and they'll actually try to sell that IP to their former competitors. And so when you're choosing a smaller company like this, it's very important that you make sure you understand what the risks are, because you might give your business to a company that decides not to be in this business anymore or is being bought by somewhere else.
And
okay.
If I may, Mark, that's a very good point. If you turn that around to the customer making sure that they're doing their due diligence, and if the customer is considering putting their mission-critical systems into the cloud, a question I've often heard, which is important, is not just about the facilities, but also about the skills of the people, how long the support staff have been in place, how many customers that service provider is handling. Is there one customer that makes up 95% of the revenue base? And so what happens if that customer goes away for whatever reason? And there's also a cost situation involved with all of that, making sure that the people that are in place have the background knowledge to be able to support the customer as if the customer is getting an extension of their data center services, as opposed to being nickeled and dimed for every change that may occur, because we all know that there are constant changes in the environment. So I just wanted to add that in.
Okay, that's a fair point. Yeah.
Mark, there are a couple of good questions coming in as well, actually several on this. First one is regarding the consolidation that you mentioned with some of these smaller firms. And so the question is really about what's driving it. Is it to get access to the competence or the skills, or is it the IP they're after? What are you saying?
Well, that's a very good question. It's also very interesting. I think the basis for this is what I said before, that that a cloud, in its very essence, is really about an operating model, being able to do something in a certain way. And so I don't think smaller cloud companies are being bought because of the customers that they have, or the fact that they have resources that are comfortable with pay-by-the-drink models, and we're seeing a lot of resistance in bigger companies there. No, I think that the main reason for companies in the future to acquiring these smaller players is basically for the IP. It's for the cloud platform. It's purely an IP play, I think. And so what will happen is they'll try and integrate that advanced technology into their own relatively large organizations. And so the challenge is going to be whether or not they'll be able to have the operating model to match the technology that they're buying. But it's a very good question.
Another one I think you can answer quickly, and I'd like to hear the answer to it as well. So this question is related to, are you recommending staying with established firms like Google and Amazon? Some of these interesting small firms.
It's a good question, and I think and we'll get to there in a little bit. I think the point is that it depends for what. If we're talking about email, yeah, fine. But there's also parts in this industry where we're talking about enterprise-grade compute consumption in a cloud. So running SAP in a multi-tenant public cloud. And right now, the bigger players, most of the well-known names, actually don't have the technology to do that right. And then some of the smaller players, they absolutely do have the technology to do that right. And so when you're asking, should I stay with an established company, it's really about, what it is that you're trying to move to a cloud and what it is that you expect. If you expect no service levels, then some of those companies might not be an issue.
Thanks.
Okay. Let's go to the next slide. So when you're analyzing your application portfolio and you're coming up with these batches of applications that you want to move, there's really two things that you need to look at. And one is, can my applications be in different locations? And this is assuming that you can't just pick up your entire compute environment and move it into a cloud and have it run there and that's it. The reality is that in most companies, you go in, you find a whole portfolio of applications, and there's always a few that need to stay behind. And those that stay behind or go somewhere else, they still need to be able to communicate with the apps that are going to a cloud-based solution. And so the issue really becomes, if you're separating these geographically, are they still going to be able to communicate? And so the interesting thing is that the common assumption is, yes, of course, but then the reality is, well, maybe not. And sometimes it's as simple as a latency issue. Sometimes it's actually regulations that will not allow sending any data outside of a building. But there's various reasons why some applications just need to be physically close to other applications. And then the second aspect of this is more of a logical separation. Can we have the entire, let's say, application compute part in one place, and then more of the database and storage part in another place? And so this creates very different problems. And so sometimes the solution then is creating a small on-premise private cloud where you're running all the stuff that needs to stick together and can't communicate over larger distances or can't be separated geographically. And then use that in conjunction with a larger cloud at the vendor location. And so the benefit in that is that those two clouds then have a platform to communicate on when it's similar technology. And so that leads to a hybrid cloud that gives you the best of both worlds. And so I think the takeaway from this part is that, when you go into a situation where you are considering taking your computer environment into a cloud, the analysis of the application portfolio is extremely important, and it needs to be done well. As we'll talk about later on, there's also issues, when companies are trying to go to a cloud and, they sign up with the company and they come in and they have a budget for the transition plan, and oh wow, we don't even know, exactly what the specs are of all these interfaces between these apps. And a good solid portfolio analysis and diligence will actually prevent unexpected costs going forward. So next slide. Compliance, when we're looking at a vendor of software as a service or infrastructure as a service or any cloud service, they need to be able to comply with any regulations that you are beholden to. And so I've listed a few that we regularly encounter, and these regulations are very, I want to say, easily understood by the companies that need to comply with them. So if you are a company that delivers products to the military, then you are probably well aware of everything that ITAR means. That doesn't necessarily mean that everyone that is in the marketplace and that you are considering moving your computer environment to has the same awareness. So that's the first thing to think about. The second thing, and these are some examples of the issues that we encounter, is that even though that they might say they're able to do so, in the end, they don't have the staff. Sometimes you need to have local resources, U.S.-based resources, or even U.S. citizens doing the work on a project. And if these resources aren't available, then it doesn't matter that they're available for other customers. This vendor just doesn't work for you. Another issue that we find is that sometimes because of this, there are unexpected surcharges for what they call onshore resources. And it almost sounds funny if you look at it like this way, but we've actually seen 2 instances of clients in the last 12 months signing up with a provider and having rock-solid agreements in place around the way the vendor is going to comply with all of the regulations. And they're up and running, and the vendor comes up and says, well, we misunderstood this or that. We can't really comply there unless we do X, Y, Z, which then usually entails adding onshore resource or adding costs for onshore resources versus offshore resources. And, once you're there, it's really difficult to say, no, let's not. You got to fix it in a different way, because you need to comply with the regulations. And if you don't, you won't be able to sell to company XYZ. It's going to cost your company money. And so I think the takeaway here is that you need to identify all the compliance regulations, data protection directives, European data directives that there are. Perform diligence from the perspective of compliance and cost. So make sure that you understand what it's going to cost. And then I think the most important thing maybe is that you make sure that you are not the first client with this requirement that is going to be served by this vendor. There is no better way to make sure that the vendor actually understands what you're talking about than asking them, have you done it before, and can you show me? And then them saying yes. Okay, next slide.
Mark, when it comes to compliance with regulations and that sort of thing, particularly like ITAR and so forth, is there any way that you can isolate systems in a way that can still meet the compliance requirements, or is it all or nothing?
No, it's not all or nothing. If you have to, let's take the example of ITAR and the ERP system. Factually, what that means is that knowledge of the bill of materials of some of these products can't be in any country other than the U.S. People outside of the U.S. Or non-U.S. citizens actually can't touch the bill of materials if they can make sense of it. So if it's hashed or encrypted or split up or just numbers without the other tables that go with the numbers explaining what it is, then it really doesn't matter. So yes, there's a way to isolate that, both functionally or geographically, I would say, you could say, all right, all these resources in the U.S., you can work on all of the business units in the company except the business unit that is selling to the military. That's one way to do it. And the other way to do it is actually saying, all right, okay, this part of the table you can't look at, so this one's off limits. So you'll have to work with proxy numbers or interpretations. There's usually a way that this can work, even for a company that uses offshore resources, but still figuring this out and making sure it works, and then checking that what you agreed with is actually done and that the data is protected. It's not going to be free. And so the point really was that there are going to be unexpected costs. And so this might still be the case if you're able to do it this way.
Okay.
Okay. Next slide, please. All right. Peak demand. So when looking at a cloud, I think one of the most often asked questions is, when does it start to make sense to do this? When are we actually going to be in a position where going to a cloud is going to save us money? And then very often this is expressed in terms of size. Is my compute environment large enough? Or the question is, my compute environment is already virtualized in my own data center. Can I still save cost or improve performance? And so the answer we generally give is that the primary driver for determining cost savings in a cloud environment is not so much how big your compute environment currently is, but the variability of your compute environment over time. And so, for example, if you're looking at CPU usage, so it's usually RAM constrained, sometimes it's CPU constrained if you're looking at a virtual environment. But if you're looking at CPU over time, this can fluctuate wildly. So in a typical situation, 5 in the morning, all kinds of financial batches start running, and they just max out whatever capacity the servers have in an organization. And so the rest of the day, 90% of the performance of this hardware is actually untapped. So that means you have a peak, and then after that it's flat and you're underutilizing your hardware. So in a typical situation like that, a cloud makes a ton of sense, because the theory is, of course, when you're bundling together all of these companies that have different peaks at different times, that evens out. And so as a percentage of total power available, you're actually doing a much better job of utilizing your hardware. And so having said that, the problem really becomes in knowing whether that's the case or not. And so, being able to tune your own hardware to run your applications properly is very different from having a holistic view of all of your applications and how they compute all the different resources over time. And I'm talking about CPU, RAM, I/O, storage. And so what you really need to do is measure this. And so there's a bunch of ways to do that. If you haven't done this before, it's a little tricky. You have to at least measure this for a month, so you have your month-end close and all that stuff in there. But the good news here is that there's actually a lot of vendors. Some of these are the type of companies I talked about earlier, these younger and newer companies. And these vendors will measure this for you over the course of more than a month at little to no cost, just for a chance to win the business. And so the point is, in general, if you know that your compute consumption over time resembles a completely flat line all the time, a cloud might not save you a lot of money. However, if it's very, very variabilized, if there's large peaks, then in general, it does make sense to go to a cloud to save money.
Yeah,
Mark, there are a number of questions here that I think I'm going to try to put them all into one. The first one is around how to measure compute in this environment, right? I mean, is there a standard measure of unit of measure? And then combine that with several questions here about pricing. And I think they come together, right? How can you price? I mean, the question is about hourly or monthly pricing or per unit charges. So
So when we were talking about the definition of the cloud before, one of the attributes was it needs to be measurable. And so being able to measure it doesn't mean just keeping track of time and then billing someone on the basis of, well, you've used our services for 1 hour and you're going to be charged this. So, in general, a cloud is conceptualized as being such that, if you're using something, you're paying. If you're not using something, you're not paying for it. So a virtual machine that's not using any resources other than maybe a fraction of licensing shouldn't cost you anything in terms of CPU, RAM, I/O, or storage billing. And so the interesting thing then is, how do they measure this? Well, they measure it with some appliances that they put in your data center, or very nifty software that they also use to do discovery and find all the applications that you have in the first place. But the point is, it just measures CPU, RAM, I/O, and storage over time. And then that needs to be translated into a price. And so what most vendors do is that they actually translate the consumption of these variables into a unit, into a compute unit, the same way that you would be able to pay for water because you can measure how big a liter is. And so different companies are using different ways to do that. The interesting thing is that they usually create like a small, I want to say like a sort of an abstracted virtual machine that has a set amount of CPU and a set amount of RAM in it. And then what they'll do is they'll game the system a little bit because what they'll do is they're going to change the makeup of these units so that it's either going to be RAM constrained or CPU constrained. To make a very long story short, there are units being used right now, but there is not an industry standard. It's something we're going towards. It's not there yet. It's also necessary for federation, but like I said, we're not there yet. Next slide. Knowledge, or the types of people you need. I think a lot of what's on here we talked about before, so I'll go through this a little bit more quickly. Basically what we're seeing is the polarization of knowledge in the market, and this has two aspects. One is the fact that the content knowledge about what you're actually selling is different in a small cloud company from an established player. So what we're seeing is that bleeding edge technology companies are very rarely able to support legacy properly. And so mainframes, AS400, stuff like that, usually you can't go to a small startup cloud company to get that done properly. And then the second part here is knowledge within your own organization. If you're buying cloud services instead of running an IT organization or a data center, what happens is that it's a very different type of people that you need for that. And so again, this comes back to that the cloud is not a suite of technology, but an operating model requiring, instead of technologists within your company, people are able to manage vendors and make sure that the operating model is being upheld. Okay, next slide. Yeah, we already talked about this a little bit before too. Make sure that all the costs that are going to be necessary to transition into a cloud are accounted for when you calculate if or not this is going to save you money. And then some of the things that need to be in there but sometimes aren't are the cost of having to virtualize some of your existing applications before they can go to a cloud, upgrading software, updates, patches and fixes to existing platforms and software, having to re-platform applications because the platform is not supported by the cloud infrastructure. And so the interesting thing here is that you need to be very diligent in this startup phase of moving to a cloud, that you actually think about all these things and account for them in your model. And then ask yourself the question, can all these costs really be justified by the savings that you anticipate? And we find that companies are very optimistic about how easily they can get there and that their journey is often pretty ugly. Next slide. Yeah, this is keeping the wheels on the bus. It's an expression that we hear a lot for the suite of apps or the mainframe or the AS400s running, whatever, that they need maybe aren't completely critical, therefore don't warrant the investment in software upgrades, patches, a lot of maintenance. And so these software and hardware combinations, they usually they just need to be there. They don't need to improve dramatically over time. And so we're calling that keeping the wheels on the bus. And so in combination with what I said before, you know, in cases where you have apps or hardware that you know, you just need to keep as is, we're seeing some real benefit from specialized companies that are able to look at that are able to meet your existing mainframe or AS400 needs. And I think some of these companies don't even require you to upgrade your software. Well, I know for a fact that Blue Hill is able to take on your mainframe or AS400 and will allow you to run it as is. But it's something that we don't see a lot. And it's also something that we think is very valuable in combination with a small company that has very sophisticated technology that you might want to use. And then you know, you might consider, well, they can't do anything with my mainframe or AS400. It really makes sense to consider other types of companies and then maybe have two vendors. And so then these vendors need to be able to talk to each other, and you need to assign responsibilities between these companies on how they communicate and what's their responsibility, what's your responsibility, and all that stuff. But it's something that makes a lot of sense right now. And the more that knowledge in the industry is going to polarize, the more of this we're going to see.
Yeah, and to your point, Mark, in terms of legacy, especially on the mainframe, we are seeing, with our ability to leverage hardware, software, staff resources, we're seeing savings of anywhere between 25 and 60%. We have actual, you know, case studies on this stuff where, again, you know, these applications are critical to the business. However, they're not changing over time. They just need to be maintained in the manner that the end users are used to be receiving this information that they rely on. So cost savings continues to be a key element, especially, you know, like you say, to keep the wheels on the bus, to make sure that you just keep going down this path and allow your IT department to be able to create new revenue opportunities, new revenue streams, maybe using cloud technologies in a different way. But yeah, responsibilities matrix we find is extremely important in dealing with the customer and also with other service providers in working together, so everyone knows who's responsible for what, and there aren't any additional hidden costs. You know, the gotchas is what we hear a lot when we're negotiating. Just making sure that the costs are predictable and the service levels are being met.
Okay.
Rosary, that might be a good segue into this question that just came in. The question is, can you lend some insight as to the most cost-effective way to deal with managing legacy applications on older mainframe hardware that they've inherited as part of a merger and they don't have the skills in-house? Can you comment on that?
Oh. Yeah, sure. That's where a lot of our business comes from, actually, because mainframe skills are harder and harder to get. Most of the mainframe support people out there are in retirement age. And so it's happened to us quite recently, actually, where a company was outsourced with all of their mainframe, their AS400s, their servers. They were paying about 50% more on the mainframe side than they realized they needed to pay. However, they didn't have the skills in-house. They weren't at the latest levels in terms of software, and they weren't prepared for the risk involved with needing to upgrade that, which is what they were hearing from other service providers. So we deal with those situations quite often, You know, the flexibility is real important to a lot of customers. So yeah, there are service providers out there that can help in those situations. The biggest cost drivers tend to be the hardware and upgrading that, as well as the third-party software that a lot of customers are not aware of in terms of who's owning which licenses and how to leverage enterprise-level agreements that like Blue Hill has in place to be able to extend those savings out to their customer base. Does that answer the question?
It would appear to, yes.
Yeah, okay, good.
All right. Let's go to the next slide, please. And so this is the last point in the line of 9 reasons not to go to a cloud-based solution. And point 9 really deals with does the company, and so sometimes that may be a prospective customer or a client or their own company, do you really understand what the cloud is, and do you really understand what it is that you need from it? And so I think to point to an earlier question, you know, is it better to stay with an established player like Google or Amazon? Well, this is a very specific type of cloud, and even though it's getting a lot of media exposure because it's something that the average consumer knows about, it's not necessarily the most enterprise-grade cloud in the world. And so there are many different types of cloud for many different types of needs. And so basically what this means is that you need to be very careful when you're talking about the cloud, when you're talking to a company, that you make sure that you are actually using the same definitions. And so that, you know, what savings are you looking for? And can I achieve them by virtualization? Virtualization is another point. You know, are you being honest about what it is that you think you're going to save? Do you have actual knowledge of what the variability of your demand is right now? And is having a cloud solution not just a synonym of having robust DR in place, because that's the assumption. Having a cloud solution gets you DR for free almost. And so I think wrapping up this slide and wrapping up the entire series of slides here, you know, we've seen the industry change. It's gotten from having to push companies towards the cloud to having to stop them from throwing everything at the cloud. And I think going forward, what's going to separate good companies from truly excellent companies is the ability to intelligently decide what type of cloud to use for what part of your application portfolio. And a last piece of advice I'd give is make sure that you have the people that know about this stuff involved in the process as soon as possible, because the sooner you do that, the less costly mistakes are going to be in the future. All right, that wraps up my slides.
Okay. Rosary, if you'd like to move to your slides.
Yeah, I just want to go through a few slides very quickly, and rather than make this a sales pitch, more of an understanding of how customers that may have specific selective requirements that are mission critical, who are looking for the skill sets required to maintain those necessary applications. That's what Blue Hill is all about. We have state-of-the-art data centers. You're looking at a picture of our production site in Pearl River, New York, which is about 20 miles up the Palisades Parkway from the GW Bridge in New York City. It was actually built for the New York Stock Exchange, the complex was, back in the early 90s. And then the Stock Exchange got a better deal, decided to stay in Manhattan, and so the facility became ours along with Verizon. So there's 2 COs in the building. There's great power. We've never lost power. I think we have a slide about that. There's actually an underground city between the 2 buildings. The shorter building was built as an all-purpose data center. And We provide all of our services from onshore, although we also have data centers in Branchburg, New Jersey, Connecticut, Georgia, and California. And we do have those deep technical skills for all of the various disciplines in the data center, mainframe, open systems, AS400. And another differentiator is our dedicated disaster recovery model. So most people are familiar with subscription-based disaster recovery, where you get in line if, in fact, there's a regional unplanned outage or disaster. We learned a lot from 9/11. We learned that the people that could not get into their DR facility because they were the 8th or 20th company declaring a disaster couldn't get on the plane to go to an alternate city because all the planes were grounded. And so what we decided to do was make our disaster recovery for our customers dedicated, which means you always have a spot, have unlimited test time to be assured an accurate test each and every time you need to have one. The next slide, please, talks about our core services, and we've talked about mainframe, mid-range, all of that. We also offer workstation recovery seats. But surrounding that is really about our account management structure. You know, anytime you're going to take systems that are critical to your business and move them off of premise in a private cloud solution, you want to make sure that your service levels are being met. You also want to make sure there's a great level of trust involved so that, you know, they're as responsible as you are for getting your end users the support that is required. So that's what all of those circles mean around there, making sure that there's a tried and true migration planning and execution strategy, and being able to talk to customers to make sure that you know, they're happy with the service. And the next slide, we have some quotes from the last major storm that occurred in the Northeast. It was Hurricane Sandy. And we're happy to report that we did not lose power, and we got quite a lot of slaps on the back, you know, thank yous from some of our customers, although we did go through our preparedness program to ensure that all of the necessary actions could be taken if, in fact, we did need to resort to generator power, which we have in place, those kinds of things. Interestingly enough, it's really about the people. It's about communicating effectively and often with the customers to make sure that they, in turn, can not have any fears coming through from their end user community that they're responsible for. And with that, I think I can turn it back over to Mike for the final slide.
Thank you, appreciate it. We have a couple of minutes left, and I'm trying to dig through a number of really good questions here and see if we can answer a few of them.
Okay.
This one may be simple. Mark, for the question is for the very basic offering of platform as a service.
Yes.
Is the decision generally a fruitful one?
Is the decision generally a fruitful one? I'm not sure I understand the question, Mike. Does that mean that? Go ahead.
Well, I can, let me take a stab at that one. If you're trying to save money and keep your service levels at the same or better than you're used to, yes, platform as a service can be very fruitful to the organization, especially if you could free up some of your talent to be working on better ways or more interesting, newer ways to bring in new revenue streams to your organization, so that your IT group becomes, you know, a central part of your revenue stream for your company, as opposed to just, like you said before, keeping the wheels on the bus.
Yeah,
and that's what we hear time and again.
What I'd add to that, Rosary, is that platform as a service as opposed to infrastructure or software as a service is like this middle ground where you have some more flexibility than buying software from a company and taking it as is and having no influence on the roadmap, and it has less complexity as having infrastructure as a service and having to do everything on it yourself. I think the problem I see with platform as a service going forward is that it's just going to be a matter of lock-in. And so in the same way that you don't have any influence on what exactly it is that software as a service can do, you're going to have very limited influence on the APIs that you want or whatever it is. And so my worry is that it might be easier and more modular in the short term, but very costly lock-in on the long term.
All right, thank you. And I think we have time for one more, and I'm going to throw it out there because I love the question. And either one of you or both of you can answer this. The question is about enterprise systems, ERP running in the cloud, and it was even mentioned SAP running in the cloud. And so the question really is, when you talk about enterprise ERP running in the cloud, are you using your definition, Mark, your definition of cloud that you brought up at the beginning of the presentation? And if so, do you have any specific examples where it's successfully working?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a great question because there's ERP running, SAP running in private clouds, but I think the true promise of efficiency and cost savings is the multi-tenant public cloud. And of course, the problem's always been data security, segregation. And basically, because of that, a lot of fear, companies haven't moved there. But to answer the question briefly, yes, I'm seeing that happen. I'm seeing customers running their production SAP environments on a multi-tenant public cloud. This is for environments that have thousands and thousands of users. For a number of clients that we've actually helped last year, this is the case. So absolutely, it is the case that this is possible, but you have to be pretty smart about which provider you're using for this, both in terms of raw technical capability as well as whether the economics work, because there's no point in having ERP in a multi-tenant public cloud if that's going to end up being twice as expensive.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Okay, well, while there are a number of really very good questions still outstanding, particularly around cost savings, and there's even a good one around indemnification, liability, and a lot of good questions left. We are out of time, but we will promise to follow up on the questions that have been submitted, and all the materials, including the presentation that's been shown here today, will be on outsourcing.com. So once again, thank you for joining us. We hope you found this to be informative and helpful on your cloud journey. If you have any further questions, the contact information is posted there and also on outsourcing.com, and we'll be happy to engage. So thank you very much.